Okay, Greg. Let's start with a popular question, but people always have unique takes on it, I find. And that is, what are your thoughts on the First Amendment?
On the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And that is freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that in general, it's a good idea. I think that there are some, legal needs for some control, yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Mm-hmm.
The question is always, how do you determine that?
That's always true, yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think intent plays into your review of the First Amendment?
Let's see. I think that intent is, required for determining whether you were trying to commit some crime with, what you were saying. But for the most part, the idea in the First Amendment, I would think, is just that you're trying to get information out. You're trying to get as wide a variety of input into, solving the problems of society as possible. And I kind of take this, more from a historical perspective. I enjoy studying history, and not so much a legal perspective in my own realm. It's certainly not a specialty, being scientists, IT, but I have spent a good amount of time in studying Soviet Union and Russian studies, and doing some of the comparison between what they mean by some of these same things, because it's interesting how many countries have adopted something similar to the U.S. Constitution.
That's true.
But don't implement it in the same way.
Looking to you, China.
Vietnam
There you go.
is the classic. Yeah. So back to the question of intent. Is there anything else that you were hoping to hear?
So, it's two parts from what I heard. I think your more historical perspective, one could say, affects your view of what the First Amendment should do.
Right. I think the founding fathers were working on an experiment, and they realized that right from the beginning. I think they had a good sense that they were not going to please everybody. They were infighting themselves quite a lot. I mean, certainly the musical Hamilton has brought to the forefront a lot of the just in the gutter, knockdown, drag out fighting that they did between Jefferson and Hamilton. I found the biography that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical to be just very, very interesting. Just all of the details of Hamilton's life and how he faced his disappointments, as well as just worked like crazy, like all of the other inspired geniuses on his part of the founding of the country.
So if you were to say Greg is transferred back in time, 1600s, he is elected king for a temporary time.
Benevolent dictator.
Yeah. But he has one function. He is the king of the Constitution. So he, for 1 year, gets to deliberate and craft his golden work, which should be commemorated throughout all the time. Well, how would he write the First Amendment, and what would his intentions be?
It's really hard to go back in time and put yourself in that period and go, how far in the future am I looking out for? Because, part of putting together a new country and putting together laws for a new country, setting the values for a new country, happened in the moment. And so some of the challenges that we have today with social media, the algorithms that change, or prioritize differently how things appear to be popular ideas versus just radical ideas.
Yeah.
The things that strike you as being, wow, that's really incredible. That's I can't believe it. That can't be true. Those are the things that stick with us, and not and today we, passed another law to pay for plumbing upgrade in, the South Capitol neighborhood or something.
Yeah.
That stuff just doesn't surface. And I think that the Founding Fathers intended for things to be interpreted and change as society grew. I think that they had in mind that Jefferson said we needed a revolution every 20 years. Blood should be spilt. But I think at the same time, they wanted to be able to adapt to changing conditions without having the bloodshed, having the peaceful transition of the presidency, and George Washington stepping down and saying, my time is done. It's time to follow the process that we set down and we would like to have, which is, people shouldn't be too long in power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So keep moving. Give somebody else a chance. The thing I think that they didn't get, which is not so much the First Amendment, is just how elections work, how the public takes up elections. That it's vote the SOB out. It's
That's true. Yeah, hate voting.
If they're not, hate voting. It's and it doesn't really accomplish what in government is the long haul. That's the thing that makes the most difference in our society is, keeping on a problem until we get it solved and making the gradual changes that need to be made to solve it. And that, to a certain extent, takes the bureaucracy of government to do it. And in order to have a bureaucracy that's going through that process, they may take input from the constituents. They take input. The good government bureaucracies take input from industry. They take it from private citizens. They take it from, the concerned groups, environmental groups or Second Amendment groups. They're going to be, considering those perspectives and trying to put together a coherent plan that can pass the legislative process. Because ultimately the legislative process is where the laws get created, and then the judicial would be, the final word on how to interpret those laws. If you didn't put the law together completely the first time, or you didn't consider that situation, where do we take that? So I think that they didn't really consider how the hate voting was going to be so disruptive to just getting things done. And it's really what a lot of people are frustrated with now, is that government is not getting things done because there's an us and a them, and there's no meeting ground in the middle to decide, okay, we got this problem. We agree it's a problem, or we don't agree that it's a problem. I mean, that may be another thing, is maybe we don't agree it's a problem. But, it's not going to get solved if you don't have that middle ground somewhere. That's a challenge for social media and the First Amendment.
So how would you maybe help that or solve that problem?
I think that one of the books I'm reading now, Breaking the Social Media Prism, is looking at how those algorithms really are there to sell commercial ad time The more outlandish something is, the more it sells, and the more money the Facebook gets for whatever it is that their constituents that they are not responsible for are going to spark enough interest that it keeps people engaged and keeps people looking at the commercials.
Yeah.
What the suggestion is that we de-emphasize that you've got to, somehow. I think the best one that I heard was looking at just pure counts of how many times somebody writes, and looking at the number of 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, 99%, 95%. If somebody is posting 99% and they're just one person, do you really give them more than 1 sigma of bandwidth in that channel? And what it does is it just, it keeps that interest from compounding. It just doesn't go jump. It goes up 1, and then you've got to manually repost that if you're going to do it again. You can't just retweet, like, share. And that's just numerics. And it gives a better sense of what people in general are thinking rather than just the ends of the far right and the far left. And if you can't measure it, you can't change it. You can't improve it. So that's, probably the best I've seen.
Yeah, I actually really like that one. Actually, I haven't heard that one before. I will remember that. Now, how about censorship and social media? It's a big question, but how should they...
Well, there's a lot of disagreement about what is censorship, because the folks that are being fact-checked are saying, well, I don't agree with that. By telling me that that's not a real fact, or telling all of my potential readers that's not a real fact, you're censoring me.
I don't say that's like censorship.
Yeah.
I think it's more of like just deleting it, or it's called blacklisting, kind of. No, shadow-banning, there you go. That's a term.
Yeah.
But that's be more of censorship, whereas the fact thingy, I feel like that's a bit more power to put into one group to say, my word is the fact.
Right.
So I'm against that one on that grounds, but that's not as bad as like...
That's more of a third-party reviewer and who trusts the third party. Mm-hmm. The pure censorship is... the example right now is what's happening in Russia. Mm-hmm. You can't even stand on a street corner with a sign that says nothing, or a sign that says dva slova, 2 words. And dva slova means, F Putin, in the terms of the security police. You can't get away with that. They're going to handcuff you. They're going to send you away for re-education. If you are actually able to post something on social media that is contrary to, the party line, they can pick you up in the middle of the night. That's the way it was back in the 30s. Khrushchev did a lot to kind of ease out of the hard line control. Stalin was worried about losing control, and Putin is worried about losing control. And in order to have that control, you have to control the message 100%. They thought there was nothing wrong with having a ministry of propaganda. That's how you get your word out of what the government is going to be doing for you. And if you have a contrary view, well, talk about it with us in prison.
There you go. So, you answer the question. You gave the example of true censorship, which is by the government in Russia. Mm-hmm. But how about companies? how should companies, like ideally in your mind, to promote, I guess, like the best discourse on a given platform, kind of are where a public square is, one could say.
Yeah.
How should they be managed by the companies?
Well, I think companies are mostly managed by contract, but they're also managed by some amount of regulation. You know, the FCC has regulations for what can be put on radio and TV. Probably those same regulations should stand in some degree on social media.
Yeah, I see that.
You know, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And some of what social media does as a amplifier of third parties, you know, the subscribers, is exactly that. So I don't know how to regulate that exactly, but I think it's probably a problem for the FCC. FCC should probably step up more in that area. The contract side of it is another one, because we've gotten really a contract for, and there's a problem with the contracts because they're all click through. You know, that means that they give you 500 pages of contract to read, and you have to decide whether you're going to click yes, I agree, or no, I'm not. And everybody just clicks I agree and moves on without considering what they've actually agreed to. And so the result of that is when people become unhappy with what they agreed to, they take it back to the company and say, well, you didn't tell us this. And the company says, well, yes, we did. But if you want us to change it, because the FCC or whoever is regulating them now says, actually, that was kind of an unfair practice, unfair trade practice, unfair privacy practice. Privacy is a big one right now. You should be taking that customer into consideration and allow them to delete the unfortunate information that they posted on their own social media site. You know, they're no longer 15, and we shouldn't hold that against them for the rest of their lives. You know, that's kind of where the contract switches over into regulation, because at some point you have to say, you know, it's all well and good that this, what they posted when they were 15 is really juicy, but you can't keep that forever. You've got to allow people to know what other people can see, allow them to change what other people can see, delete their accounts, including all references that they may have sold to third-party other social media or advertisers. Or so there's a process or a possibility of de-identification of some of that. And you know what the advertisers want really is just what are our markets. But as they've found that they can get deeper and deeper into the souls of people, they really like to have all the detail that they can get on everybody. So I don't know that unless we, like California, adopt the European privacy practices, it's going to be really hard to pull all of that information back. I'm not even sure that the Europeans can do it. However, they do have penalties, you know, civic penalties, money, fines that can be applied if they are found to be ignoring the privacy regulations and continuing to hold information after the fact. I think that, you know, government has also a challenge managing their information and protecting the privacy of their constituents. You know, the agency I work for doesn't really try to collect that information. Occasionally people provide a private address or private phone number because they don't have a business work. But they have the ability to clean that up if they need to. There are certainly old legacy databases in some agencies or organizations that need to be cleaned up, need to be archived and taken offline, so to speak. But a lot of those have already escaped into the wild. The Washington state has one of the most lenient public records disclosure laws in the nation. So if somebody asked for that data before somebody realized that it could be used for data mining 20 years hence, that information has already flown the coop, and the companies that have it, unless we start to enforce a privacy law or even have a privacy law in Washington, there's nothing anybody can do about it. It's only if the company is based in California or in Europe that you really have a chance. A lot of companies have said that they're going to adhere to the European privacy laws, but it's not always easy to find out how. They make it pretty obscure for how to fix their records if you want to, fix your own personal information.
So you mentioned privacy laws. So what would be an example of these? Like, what would be the effect, or how would you write it?
Well, I think the GDPR in Europe is the most comprehensive. They're basically saying that you can't keep information about me without my permission. Mm-hmm. You can't sell it without my permission. You can't dispose of it or share it with anybody else without my permission. And I have the right to review all the information that you have and correct it or delete it if I want to. The penalties involved, they're civic penalties, so they're money. So it's really the profitability of the company. It does open up some questions of, well, if some company had this information and then they go bankrupt, are they liable for that penalty? Can they just hang on to that data as a bankrupt corporation and use it as long as they want to? That's a question.
It is.
So I don't think that we could do much better than that. Certainly companies have a need to have information. The government has a need to keep information. And I think government has maybe a higher authority to keep information because they are going to be keeping track of criminal records, tax records, public service or military records, those kinds of things that, for public safety and for doing our fair share, somebody needs to be tracking that, but it needs to be safeguarded. And applying the penalties to government entities is often a lot harder when there's no real enforcement other than you need to stop doing this. You need to clean up that database and archive it so that it's offline and nobody can access it by accident. However, as I said, some of it's flown the coop into the wild. So how do you track that down? I don't know.
I don't think you really can.
Right.
But there's one more question. What would be the ideal for a social media platform in your mind? Like, if you had infinite options of social media companies and you got to choose one to be the ideal, what would it be?
I think if you're just trying to connect with folks, having a limited lifespan on the postings would be a good idea. You could automatically have an expiration on your posts so that they don't go on forever. Like, something that you post in a juvenile time period should not last any farther than 18th birthday or something. Some people care more than others about what stays out there and what is available. I think the average person doesn't have a lot of dangerous information or things that are going to harm them posted to social media. So I do think that having a default duration or expiry would be a good idea. And if you want to leave something out there further because you're not somebody who posts on a daily or even annual basis, you might want to have that last a little bit longer, or be able to say, hey, this is something about my life that I would like people to know about, or my friends to know about, forever. There's no denying the high school that I graduated from. It's going to be with me forever. So that could just stay. But giving that option. Beyond that, I think that's really the core of the privacy issue, and with social media, again, the over amplification is something that I would like to see eliminated. And again, the numeric studies seem to show that, if you just put a muffler on the most common promoters, that would probably do a lot. We find ourselves also in situations where we can't even, land developers, development companies cannot get a project done successfully because the not in my backyard people are so vocal and so animated, and they show up to every local government meeting and post to the internet or to social media to get a rise out of people. Show up at this committee meeting to protest building a Safeway or building new housing development, and we do need housing. Building, rebuilding infrastructure or building better infrastructure. Those kinds of things are slowing way down. I think that one of the figures I saw was that it costs like 10 times more to build a piece of underground track for a subway in the United States than it does in Europe or anywhere else in the world, because there are so many environmental statements that may or may not have a real impact. They fill up 4 years of delay time doing the environmental impact statement on something that really has minimal impact. And you got to figure out how are we going to get around that? That's again a question for perhaps government. How do we move the process along for getting the things that we need without over amplifying, the few people that are, at risk of having a train run through their backyard, or an apartment building built next door. There are many neighborhoods all across the United States that are single residency only zoning. And if we're going to build enough housing for folks, you've got to have the duplexes in the neighborhood. You've got to have an apartment building in the neighborhood, because those are the more affordable places to live. Not everybody gets to live in a castle. That's maybe a little bit too far a value statement, but without the over amplification, the decision makers and the developers can more cooperatively work towards what the communities actually need rather than what the most vocal citizens don't want.
Makes sense. That'd be very. I know that that the highway system probably couldn't be built because how much regulation there is. Do you think that's true? It would take way too long because all the.
No, I think that a lot of the transportation does get built because it is a big project that takes a lot of time to push it through. And a lot of those state departments of transportation are big enough that they can ultimately push those through. It may take 20 years. I mean, I can't even imagine why the Tacoma interchange system has been under construction the entire, 30 years that I was commuting from from Seattle down to Olympia, or even living here in the last 30 years since.
30 years?
It has not ever been completely fixed. They didn't have 6 months where that thing was not on to the next project. And, I guess, they're long chess moves that have to be made in getting a project like that done. But
that would be quite the story. I mean, like, it's going to turn into a cathedral. Like, generations of work on one project.
Right. Yeah. But with the mechanization that we have now, it shouldn't take that long.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
My goodness. That is crazy.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the pyramids or those kind of capital projects where somebody has set a goal that is, more than 5 years, more than a biennium. And our budgeting system for the state is on a biennium. They're all different kinds of budget cycles. In Japan, they've got apparently Toyota has a 400-year budget cycle where they plan what they're going to do and when it's going to happen.
That's a very long time.
It's a very long time, and I don't think any of those things have come to fruition. I mean, they've definitely hit some issues in some of their goals.
You can't even predict 400 years in the future. Like,
no. Yeah, Russia always was, Soviet Russia was always famous for having their 5-year plan. That's kind of the timeline that you need for big infrastructure.
Makes sense.
The big dams in Washington State, those were, 5-10-year projects. They took a long time to build safely and design, and, they still had problems. We've got sitting out there on Highway 8 that is never completely completed. Nuclear power plant with the cooling towers all built, but no nuclear power coming out of it.
Huh? Why is that? Not funding canceled?
Oh, they totally blew their budget. They screwed that up. That's before I started in state government, but I think part of it is, again, the vocal minority saying, well, we can't have that. It's not safe. And there's certainly reason to worry about nuclear power. There are good reasons to worry about it. But to get to a point where you've got something that is probably a pretty safe proposition, and then shut it down, I don't know that was a good use of money.
Yeah, I think it is. This is all fine and dandy, but let's do a little more of a historical view.
Okay.
So, in your opinion, what do you think are the general trends across the centuries with construction?
Construction.
Yes.
Across centuries? Well, without somebody bankrolling a large project like the pyramids, they're not going to happen. So most construction is a lot more organic. A village sprouts up, it becomes a city, people invest more and more money into it. It grows as the population grows, as the industry grows. There really only rarely needs in the past for a large infrastructure project like building a castle or building a wall around a city. They certainly existed. When we visited Lviv, Ukraine in 2017, and the castle wall, the city wall was there, but once there was no longer any use for it, it falls into disrepair. It's just a tourist attraction now. And in the U.S., we've never really had the feudal society that required walled cities. The Native Americans only rarely built fortified cities or towns. They might build a stockade. The Cahokia Mounds in Illinois had some kinds of fortifications associated with them, but not a whole lot. So America hasn't really had that kind of thing. I do a lot of mountaineers trips, backpacking, climbing, skiing, and also I'm a land surveyor. So some of my experience has been just reading through the notebooks of surveyors from 100 years ago and retracing their surveys. And I think that one of the things that strikes you is just the construction of how an animal trail becomes a superhighway. It just, over the course of time, animals have, picked a route between 2 points of interest, water source and, salt lick, something like that. Mm-hmm. Or winter feeding and summer feeding. Well, that also becomes the human path for summer and winter hunting grounds.
That's right. Oh, that sense, yeah. Hunting.
And then if there's, trading between communities on one side of the mountains and the other side, those hunting trails link up and become more of a trading route. So the things gradually grow and grow and grow until finally you're paving over a 6-lane highway between 2 points of interest, between Seattle and Tacoma, or the I-5 running up and down the whole West Coast. But getting out into the woods, you see how those things grow and how an animal trail becomes a human path, and how that becomes a forest road or something like that.
So why'd you go into surveying?
That was actually kind of an accident, because I thought what I was going to do was get a degree in physics, astronomy, and Russian, and do something like technical translation, or being at a listening post or something and being able to interpret. But I was really interested in the Russian history and the Russian political science, and the language was kind of secondary. It wasn't, I enjoy Russian lit. The tradition of Russian literature is that you can't say what you mean out loud because of the censorship. So you have to write a story about it. It's kind of like we use science fiction today. You have to write a story about it that hides the message a little bit from those who are looking too closely. And I instead got a summer job working in Alaska surveying, and it was like a paid vacation, going from village to village, surveying town sites, and doing a lot of exploring, a lot of Russian American community still up there, from the original settlements back in the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
Russians covered the whole distance from Moscow to through Siberia to Alaska in a period of about 150, 200 years. So they have the eastward expansion in the same way that we have a westward expansion, and it's they have similar ways that they operate because of that shared development path. But anyway, I decided that surveying was where I wanted to go. Went to graduate school once I finished a couple of summer seasons working up there. Worked for a couple of private companies in the Seattle, Portland, and Kitsap Peninsula, and eventually found my way into geographic information systems, land photogrammetry, photo interpretation, remote sensing, and that really all just turned into geographic information systems and IT, information technology at some point.
Slow evolution, kind of?
Slow evolution. I think that some of the analogies I've heard for how people develop their careers is not, deciding at birth when they're 6 that they're going to be a firefighter. There are people that do that, but for the most part, it's a series of choices. Do I want to do this or do I want to do that? And that leads you to your path of exploration. And I think that pretty well describes where I was. And it describes a lot of my friends who was like, well, I went into geography because I didn't want to do this. I went into IT because I liked playing with the technology, the toys. And that's not really what got me into IT so much as just the problem solving, having interesting things to work on. It's the implementation. How do you make something, a process that's working or maybe needs to work better? How do you redesign that in a way that you can automate it? And that involves working with people and working with your customer base and with your staff and trying to figure out what is it that we need to build here anyway.
So why did you not choose the Russian side? So obviously you made some choices. Mm-hmm. One summer paid vacation, and you turned your back upon the Russian literature and history and the more astronomy and physics part. Mm-hmm. So what do you think would happen if you would not do that? Like, what would your life look like?
What if I'd stayed in astronomy or stayed in Russian?
Yeah.
I think I would have had to have worked a lot harder for a lot less money, ultimately.
I see.
Those kinds of choices surface. For becoming a scientist, you really have to put in probably 10 years on your dissertation just to have completed your PhD, and they give you 10 years to do it. I think a lot of people do it faster, or they just decide they're going to become an entrepreneur and make a business out of what they learned. But somebody going into academics, they still have to compete their value with a lot of other academics, academic hopefuls. And I just saw, that as being a lot less rewarding than just looking at those diminishing returns versus getting something done for real. Getting something done was a lot more appealing to me.
I see. But why did the Russian appeal to you? Why did you like the language? And
why did it appeal in the first place?
Yeah.
I had a friend in high school who was an immigrant. He came over with his parents when he was 13 and had learned English pretty well. And he was hilarious. He was so funny. He was like always cutting down, the school, the government, pointing out all the defects and everything he saw around him, because he just wasn't allowed to do that in Russia. And it was so funny. I was like, what is this guy about? And he's like, oh, it's Russian literature. You need to study Russian literature to understand us. And I was like, okay. So I gave that a shot, and I thought, well, I'll just do one course or a couple of courses. I'll split it evenly between physics, which will probably get me somewhere, and Russian, which, it's kind of entertaining. But the more I did it, the more it just came out as I can't give up either one of these things. Mm-hmm. And so I finished, basically with a degree in physics, astronomy, and a degree in Russian, because they were both interesting. I worked hard, and my grade point was terrible because of it. Not great, but not where my peers were probably.
Yeah.
B minus average rather than an A minus or A average. So I didn't really excel in a grade point after high school until graduate school. And then it was like, okay, I'm doing all land surveying, land information systems, and photogrammetry. Like, okay, I've got something to focus on that will be a career.
So what about the Russian literature do you like? Mentioning kind of the story to hide the truth, that kind of part of it?
Hide the criticism. It hides the criticism of the idea of having a secret police, the unfaltering correctness of your leadership, the unquestioning loyalty, the Russia at the time, and still, they have not changed a whole lot since Soviet times. It was mandatory to vote in the Soviet Union, but you could only vote for one party, and if you didn't vote, they would come get you and collect you to vote. And if they checked your ballot and it wasn't for the party, they would take you away for re-education. So,
odd.
Yeah. I think Solzhenitsyn, the 19th century Russian lit and earlier was about dealing with the rulers in Russia. And so it didn't really change from, Ivan the Terrible, who killed a lot of people, Peter the Great, who, built St. Petersburg, on the pylons of the peasants that built the city in a swamp, to, Lenin, Stalin. They all saw their mission as to make Russia a great place, no matter the human cost. And people writing about that suffering is really what a lot of Russian literature is about. It's also about a great pride in everything that's Russian. And I think you see that in probably every national literature, a great pride in your own culture, your own traditions. There's one book, Blomov, is just a book more or less about food. Somebody who eats his life away. Things like that. The ridiculousness of the Russian bureaucracy. The private life of the life of Private Ivan Chomkin, which is about a bumbling soldier who is caught in a catch-22. It's written kind of along the lines of catch-22, but it was written before, I believe, in the 30s, early 40s, rather than
60s, 50s. I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the the literature really helps you see what the challenges are in Russian culture, Russian government, Russian business. You know, I think that my sister-in-law, who's from Indonesia, said that she had never encountered any place more corrupt than Ukraine, than her country before she went to Ukraine, and the whole and it's a Russian tradition. You pay me under the table for what I'm going to do for you, because you couldn't actually buy stuff in stores under Soviet Russia.
Like 3 hats.
Yeah. If they did have something in stock, you would have to buy a whole bunch of it and share it with your neighbors on the gray market. And the store situation in Russia was you would get in line to pick what you wanted from what they had available. You would get in line to pay, and then you would get in line to receive your product in the quantities that you hoped you had ordered and they still had. And you would always carry a net bag or a bag around with you, because if you saw a line, you would get into it no matter what the line was for. You would ask questions later, because clearly something that you needed was there, and that was the only way to get it.
That's quite amusing. So what do you think caused kind of Russian culture to arise? From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great to Putin to Stalin. What do you think caused the culture? Since Russia, I feel, it's not exactly it's definitely European, but it's more different than its European Union counterparts.
Well, I think that
cause a division.
I think that what a lot of people miss, Europe is very fractured, and that's because of the terrain and the topography. You've got a mountain range right in the middle of it, and actually a couple of different mountain ranges right in the middle of it. And you've got the English Channel, and you've got Italy that's isolated from everything else, and Greece with all of its islands, Spain on its own peninsula. The Slavic lands really were an open plain to invasion. Whoever was in power could just take over the whole thing. However, keeping it was another question, because the next group was going to come through and take it over. And that's the crux of the Russian-Ukraine battle right now is, they're going to be fighting a fluid battle across this open terrain. The northern part, Russia just got... They didn't pay any attention to history. The Pripyat marshes have always been there. They've always been the refuge of the Ukrainians. And they just, the Hydro War started as soon as the Ukrainians understood that the Russians were going to try that path, and they, pumped the water back into the fields, and the Russians couldn't get off the roads, because if they did, they'd get stuck. And from there, they were sitting targets. So,
there you go.
You just have to start pushing tanks off the road to get away, because you're not going to make any progress through that terrain. But one of the things that people probably don't think about, and this is, Putin's narrative is that Russia is the true inheritor of the Kievan Rus. Mm-hmm. The Kievan Rus was the flowering of Slavic culture in the 900s. And it was, several princes that battled it out, and one of them occasionally got control of the whole thing. But because they were having problems with different trading partners, notably Turkey, the Greeks, they invited basically the Vikings to come rule us, is basically the invitation. Come rule us and protect us, because you know how to fight and you know how to win. And the tradition has been that Ukraine has been a land of peasants, that, they were just part of the land. They were serfs that came with the land. They didn't have, it was slavery, but it was a different kind of slavery. It was the slaves inherit the land and they stay with the land and they give what they need to their masters.
Buying safety.
Yeah. The Kievan Rus lasted 500 years. There's a meme on Facebook and probably other places of comparing pictures of Kiev and Moscow, and over a period of 500 years, and it shows a cathedral being built in Kiev, and Moscow. Here's a trail through the woods. Kiev 1200, another giant cathedral and fortification around the city being built, and Moscow, trail in the woods. And lastly, in 1400, it's like, here's this great, glorious city, and Moscow has a village built into it. It's, so the narrative that Putin has got is, it's wrong.
Yeah.
He is claiming the Russian heritage of Kiev without acknowledging that Russia and Ukraine evolved away from each other. Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian are very closely related Slavic languages. They share that common Kievan Rus foundation, just like English and German and Dutch share that common foundation, or the Romance language have their common foundation. And the Polish and Baltic states have a different Slavic root. And the Bulgars, the Hungarians, have a different Slavic root that's very different from the Polish or the Russian, Ukrainian centered.
What do you think the main turning points in Russian history?
In Russian history?
Yeah.
So in the 1100s, I think the Novgorod, which is north and near St. Petersburg, Leningrad area, became a significant area of of Slavic government separate from Kiev. The downfall of Kiev, just by more invaders and Ukraine is the name Ukraine means the borderlands. It's the place that you fight over. It was fought over between the Polish Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire. And I think that one of the things that Putin is saying is that Ukraine never really existed as a kingdom unto itself, except in that Kievan Rus from 900 to 1400. After that, it became part of one of those other empires. Russia really was trying to emulate the West, but at the same time aggregate its power. They've got enormous resources. They've got an incredible amount of land that they can, occupy or retreat from. And, that's how they defeated Napoleon. That's how they defeated Germans in World War II. They just left a burning scab land behind and let them freeze to death in the summertime, and then let them freeze to death in the winter. And unless you know what 40 below feels like or 60 below feels like, you're not prepared for it. You got to build a fire under your diesel tank just to keep it running. Same sort of thing with Napoleon. If you didn't know that you had to sleep together in a pile of people, that's one of the things that comes out in War and Peace. Is the only reason that the army survives is that the Russians know that to survive 40 below, 60 below nights, you have to, the whole squad has to sleep in one giant heap at night. Otherwise, you're going to lose fingers and toes. And it's kind of like penguins. Somebody has to go to the outside every now and then. When they get cold enough, they fight their way back into the middle.
That's quite funny.
Yeah. So I think that also the Russian Orthodox Church, which was founded in Kiev, has been a big part of it. They're an Eastern Orthodox branch. They have set kind of the tone for what is Russia. And then, when communism hit Russia, it was bad news for the church. They abolished churches. They converted them into museums of atheism.
Some irony.
Yes. Go into a cathedral into the Museum of Atheism and see the famous relics, but you better not be caught praying next to them, or if you were, you'd better be 80 years old, because only the old believers were tolerated under the Soviet period. New believers went back to be re-educated. And I think that the idea of communism is clearly got flaws in it. The mantra is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Who's going to lift a finger to do any work if there's no reward?
Well, it's obviously it's the good old Soviet man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait.
Yeah, and there, if, from a human perspective, you also have to look at capitalism and some of the things that Marx was saying is that it can't just be a money equation, but it's the only thing that we can measure besides lives. And how do you measure lives? How do you measure the value of a life? And Marx was not willing to let somebody who was a peasant be valued less than somebody who was the owner of a company. So it was, there are a lot of contradictions between capitalism and communism, and there's some probably medium ground there that may work. Mm-hmm. Democracy is a way, a methodology, but I think that communism and capitalism are more ideals.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's sometimes hard to just say that's flawed, totally flawed. The ideal is didn't work out in any practical means for communism. It definitely couldn't compete with capitalism because it takes money to compete in the world from that kind of perspective, nation versus nation. I think that the transition out of communism was not complete, and that's where we find ourselves now. We find ourselves with a Russia being run by a KGB agent, Stasi leader. The East German police, secret police, had a worse reputation than even the KGB did, because they did it in a more efficient methodological,
I see,
German way. I think that we're seeing a lot of the issues with having an army which is not made up of secret police entirely is failing, because you can't have a political officer with a pistol to the head of your military leader and his soldiers and expect it to work well. That's where they find themselves, is that they're trying to take over a country under political motivation that is being enforced by political officers with a pistol to the head of those who are in the field. That's how it worked in Soviet Russia. Things have not changed enough. A lot of people thought that they were in a place where they had more freedom, but when push came to shove, they didn't. And that's an. I can't say that that Leninism, Stalinism was really communism. It was an autocracy, and it was Gorbachev who really took them out of that and said, "This is wrong. We should not be doing it." And he took the fall, but he also wanted to memorialize with the Memoriam Society the wrongs that were done to people under Stalinism, it was really Stalin. And I think that more wrongs are being done to both Russians and Ukrainians now under Putin. So I've got my wristband on in support of Ukraine. I got this in Lviv, Ukraine, and was told to remember their fight against Russia and the separatists that were being basically supported. The Russians were funding the separatists, that it was not really a Ukrainian battle. There might be some, but they were a small vocal minority. And most of the Ukrainians in the Donbass, Luhansk area really want to stay part of Ukraine because there are more freedoms there. I have to reiterate that this battle against Russia is a battle for freedom. It's not. It's a battle of genocide. But that's the false flag that Russia planted. They said it was a battle of Ukrainians committing genocide against Russians, but that was never really an issue in my mind. Most Ukrainians in the eastern side of Ukraine all speak Russian. 60% of Ukrainians speak Russian on a day-to-day basis. They're not a whole lot different, but everybody in Ukraine can understand Russian, and not a lot of Russians can understand Ukrainian. So the genocide that you see in Bucha and Mariupol, those are, Russians changing the message and acting out. They made the accusation and now they're doing it. And I don't. It's horrifying and it's tragic to see how much destruction Russia is wreaking on Ukraine, but I don't think Ukraine is going to lose.
Yeah, it does seem that way. Hopefully, it'll stay that way. Mm-hmm. And that, Greg, let's be off your life.
Thank you,
life of a father. So, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Hope to do another one.
Okay.
Bye.